Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining today's research seminar of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. It's great to see that we've got a few external guests joining us as well, and you're all warmly invited to come along. For those who don't know me, my name is Rob Raven, and I'm a professor here at MSDI, and I will host this seminar. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm based, the Boonwurrung people, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. And I'm very pleased today that we will hear from our own Paris Hadfield in the research seminar. Paris joined MSDI, the research team, at the very end of 2021, I believe. It's already a long time ago, so it seems sometimes you've done so much in the meantime. You've been involved in Just Transitions in Australia project. You've been working on governance of university living labs report. You've been providing great support for the ISD conference that we hosted last year. And more recently, you've been holding the pen and doing an excellent job on putting together a proposal for the RACE EOC on home energy upgrades. And I guess what draws all those different things together, I should say you've also been working on the Chitron River program as well. And I guess what draws all of that work together is your interest and your expertise in the governance and implementation pathways for sustainability transitions, and with a particular focus on questions around energy and social justice. And before joining MSDI, Paris, amongst other things, led an action research project with the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy at the Melbourne Centre for Cities at the University of Melbourne. And this is also where you did your PhD as well, funded through the CSC for Low Carbon Living, which was around finance and social justice. So that also brings us to the topic of your talk today. So really glad to have you here, Paris. We've had to postpone your talk a few times, so I'm really excited that finally we're able to pin you down for a date. And before I hand over to Paris, maybe just a few practicalities. Actually didn't ask you how long your talk would be, but usually it's around 30 to 40 minutes. Then there will be room for questions and answers. So please think of any questions or comments you would like to make during the talk, and there will be space afterwards, either in the chat, but preferably you can ask the questions live by raising your hands. So that's it from me. Paris, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rob. That introduction is very much captures what I'm trying to do in this presentation today. I'm hoping it's not too much of a information overload, but yeah, as you mentioned, I've really seeking to connect some of the early work through my PhD, looking at financial aspects of renewable energy developments, and connecting that to the idea of just transitions, and through some of the more recent work I've been doing at MSDI. I'll also note that I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people as well. And I'd also like to acknowledge some of the people I've been working with on a lot of this material. My PhD team, while I was at the University of Melbourne, Professor Lars Koenen, Professor Chris Ryan, Dr. Nicole Cook, and Dr. Sangeetha Chandrasekaran. I'll also mention some MSDI colleagues involved in the Just Transitions report as well, which I'll draw on in a moment. So just to, I guess, jump right in, the concept of just transitions has origins in labour and environmental activism and prompts a reconsideration of how all of society can thrive and achieve a good life within the biophysical limits of the planet. Energy transitions thus invite a fundamental rethinking and renegotiation of value in the economy, the built environment, everyday practices and livelihoods, and relations between society, markets, and the state. In the shift to renewable energy, we can identify both top-down renewable energy investment investment within business as usual structures of privatized energy production and services provision, and bottom-up collective social organization around social value propositions and outcomes made possible by renewable energy technologies. So the Just Transition in Australia report pictured here was published in July 2022 out of a collaboration between MSDI, the Emerging Technologies Lab, and Royal Holloway University of London through the British Academy. And this was led by Professors Pete Ade, Sarah Pink, and Rob Braven, who's here today. The report is based on evidence and practice review, as well as select expert interviews. And I had a particular focus on renewable energy in contributing to this report, which I'll draw on here to paint a bit of a picture of the Australian energy context from a justice perspective. To start with some foundational concepts that to explain what is meant by just energy transitions. Energy justice is understood in terms of procedural justice or equitable participation in decision-making and non-discrimination in how energy provision and use is managed and regulated. Distributional justice, or the fair distribution of energy resources and associated costs and benefits. And third, recognition justice, which is defined by Van Uffelen as the adequate recognition of all actors through love, law, and status order. Procedural and distributional justice are well-established tenets in energy studies, while Van Uffelen highlights that the use of the concept of recognition justice in energy literature to date is characterized by a bit more ambiguity. So the author distinguishes some key components, love and law, following the philosopher Axel Honneth. To quote the author, "When you are recognized through love, you acquire the capacity to be alone and independent precisely because you can rely on others. Energy policies or systems that prevent people from developing loving relationships can be considered unjust. Think, for example, of high energy prices that prevent households from creating a comfortable and stress-free home. Moreover, and again to quote the author, being misrecognized through laws leads to a diminished self-respect. People experience that their autonomy or moral agency is not being taken seriously. They might feel they are less human than others or less deserving of certain rights." Finally, status order in recognition justice relates to how hierarchical cultural values are embedded in formal and informal institutions, following Nancy Fraser, where misrecognition can involve cultural domination, non-recognition, and disrespect in social life. And this is not limited to political decision-making. So more broadly, energy injustices occur unevenly across space, time, and different scales in relation to wider systemic and intersecting inequalities and injustices, such as race, class, and gender. In the context of settler colonial states like Australia, the legitimacy of renewable energy transformations must also be understood relative to contested and unrealised Indigenous sovereignty, land and water rights, and self-determination, including by valuing and amplifying local Indigenous knowledges in how energy transitions are understood and envisioned. In the report, I looked at energy justice in Australia from three perspectives. The first is identifying and responding to household energy needs in particular. In Australia and elsewhere, it's clear that the incumbent system is not able to deliver energy as an essential service in a way that is universally affordable, accessible, and this condition is particularly exacerbated by poor housing quality. Households are exposed to variable market prices for energy, which continue to increase. And so this figure from Energy Consumers Australia illustrates that electricity costs in red has significantly outpaced wages growth in yellow between 2007 and 2017. This figure from St Vincent de Paul and Alvis Consulting illustrates changes in electricity prices between 2009 and 2021, showing some variability between states and territories. Experiences of energy hardship have been measured in terms of household energy debts and disconnections, which undermine adequate energy consumption to maintain basic needs and thermal comfort. These conditions affect First Nations communities with prepaid power card systems and in remote areas especially hard. Advocates also identify silent hardship among consumers paying energy bills but rationing their energy use to an unhealthy level or going without other essentials. The Australian Energy Regulator identified an increasing number of residential customers in debt and greater levels of average debt, with an average of $1,000 of debt per customer. Low-income households in national energy market jurisdictions typically spent double the percentage of their disposable income on electricity and gas as average income households, and that was a 2021 report. Next, there is a reliance on households to shop around and regularly switch energy providers to be able to obtain the best deal. State government support, rather, for consumers struggling to pay their bills typically involves aftermarket remediation, where income represents a blunt threshold of vulnerability underpinning those energy concession schemes. Current energy concession schemes can thus not account for inequalities in the energy efficiency of dwellings, household expenses, disparities in network costs passed on to consumers, climate variability, and competency in negotiating with both private providers and the concession system. In addition, disadvantaged households are more likely to be experiencing underconsumption relative to need. There are nevertheless signs that the objectives of energy market regulators are shifting beyond economic efficiency. For example, the Our Power initiative recently launched by the Australian Council of Social Services and Total Environment Centre puts forward a shared vision and actionable principles for advocacy and policy change to achieve clean, affordable, dependable energy for all. Informed by consultation with the energy sector and energy user groups, Our Power centres energy as an essential service that plays a critical role in the health and well-being of people and powers the economy. Our Power advocates for the energy futures that users want, the vision, values, and principles, and how to ensure that people and communities are heard in the process and to reflect their interests in policy development, planning, and service provision. A second perspective on energy justice in Australia is access to renewable energy. So rooftop solar PV systems are often characterised as a means of reducing energy costs for households and businesses alike, alongside their low carbon credentials. However, upfront costs have long been recognised as a barrier to uptake, as well as limits to use of rooftops, such as for apartment buildings and renters more broadly, and areas with limited network capacity to accommodate excess electricity export. How distributed energy resource costs and subsidies are recuperated also remains contested. Low uptake of rooftop solar PV systems, for example, in rental properties are typically attributed to the split incentive between private landlords who would pay for the solar system and tenants who would potentially benefit from reduced energy costs. Recent research finds some evidence of increased rental costs used to recoup solar costs, while other studies into landlord retrofit behaviour demonstrate that incentives to retrofit are more diverse and include social concerns for tenants' needs, suggesting the need to consider the role of housing agents in mediating between tenants' needs and landlords. Electricity distribution infrastructure costs and levies, including solar subsidies, are cross-subsidised via household electricity bills across the network. The magnitude of these cost transfers are more significant for high-demand appliances such as air conditioners. Other studies also highlight community concerns about neighbourhood battery storage algorithms, which are designed to maximise profit relative to price changes in the energy market. So again, this figure illustrates that average electricity bills for solar customers are substantially lower than non-solar households, with some variation between distribution networks. Government incentives and loan schemes have increasingly sought to address access issues to solar among marginalised groups such as low-income homeowners and social housing tenants, which I'll come back to a little later. New approaches to renewable energy supply are also emerging in the market. For example, Hadfield and colleagues highlight how cooperatively owned energy retailer CoPower reimagines the principles underlying energy investment in Australia, from commercial goals to social justice, democracy, and cooperative ownership. Cooperative power recognises that while some have invested in household solar or set up community wind farms, these actions are currently out of reach for most people, especially for those on low incomes and for renters. Recognising this, co-op power redistributes profits through social and environmental initiatives, including allowing members to provide solidarity credits that reduce the power bills of members experiencing hardship during COVID-19. Greenpeace also recently released the Green Electricity Guide, which identifies providers that have innovative new ways to empower customers and local communities to take more control over their electricity generation. Finally, ongoing developments highlight the potential for procedural, distributive, and recognition outcomes in renewable energy development through the sharing and commoning of benefits. Again, I'll explore these ideas in more detail shortly, but to briefly point to studies on Indigenous economic participation in renewable energy developments through consent processes, revenue sharing and ownership, as well as increasing community-based ownership of renewable energy. While it's clear that upfront capital cost is significant for decarbonising built environment, finance is popularly framed as an input resource which black boxes the rules, practices, and values constituting the financial sector and doesn't account for the ways that finance shapes the directionality of innovation. And this is something that I argue is strongly underpinning the prospects for a just energy transition. Capitalist value systems shape the forms and geographies of urban development, and critiques of these processes are well established in the human geography discipline. However, these systems tend to be backgrounded or tacitly accepted in transition studies, with some recent exceptions, including the work of Fayola and Naidu. In response, Lars Koenen and I published this review paper last year in Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions, where we argue that finance plays a structuring role in transitions and thus shapes the directionality of innovation. In the paper, we chart how finance conditions urban sustainability transitions in terms of time, space, and scale, which I'll briefly summarise here before turning to some more tangible examples. First, the temporal boundaries of finance comprise three key tendencies. Financial instruments involve speculation on the future, enabled by calculations of risk and return. This process is built into debt and share-based investment and enrolls actors and assets in repayment and interest obligations, which are fundamentally uncertain. In this way, investment in low-carbon infrastructures is guided by the confidence of investors in their financial viability or profitability. Relatedly, financial valuation and capital markets allow capital mobility and contribute to short-term profit-seeking through investment. These expectations inform cost-benefit analyses of clean technologies and can influence how governments regulate and incentivize private investment to secure revenues. At the same time, patient capital expectations associated with institutional investors preference the revenue stability of low-risk, long-term investment. Stable national and global policy landscapes around sustainability and climate change mitigation strengthen investor confidence that low-carbon interventions and standards will continue to be valued and expected, thus justifying investment. These fundamental temporal conditions subsequently direct investment towards certain technologies or locations. This process produces uneven spatial distribution of low-carbon development by excluding places or built forms that don't meet financial thresholds for investment. Finally, infrastructure provision connects local actors to global financial markets and associated volatility. Enabled by privatization, firm acquisitions and mergers, the decoupling of financing and ownership of infrastructure provision from its immediate geography limits transparency and enables global accumulation by private investors. At the same time, capital investment is shaped through local intermediation. Relevant legislation, industry networks and expertise, as well as municipalities' ability and willingness to attract private finance provide the context for whether and how easily finance flows through urban areas and can generate profit. Overall, this framework is not intended as a deterministic account of financial system logics. However, we argue that it's a productive framework for opening up the black box of capitalist finance and attend to the socially regressive processes and practices produced through capital exchange. While some transition studies point to financial innovations, these studies don't typically distinguish between business as usual financing and alternative financial arrangements. The alternative economies literature highlights the heterogeneity of capitalist economies and encourages scholars to look for difference in the pursuit and practice of alternative ethics and values. Given that capital investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency is critical to mitigating and adapting to climate change, I'm particularly interested in what public, collaborative, collective, non-extractive or distributive financial alternatives are possible from a just transition perspective. This approach aligns with Avellino's definition of transformative social innovation that challenges, alters, and/or replaces dominant institutions in accordance with social and ecological objectives. In exploring diverse forms of value in energy transitions, I also draw on feminist ethics in energy and infrastructure studies to consider how energy investment connects with how people live well, who is responsible for energy well-being, and how governments respond to household needs and vulnerabilities. I draw on Smith and Raven's conceptualization of niche scaling as a process of fit and conform and/or stretch and transform relative to existing socio-technical regimes to define financial innovations that maintain orthodox financial orders, incrementally adapt those orders, and potentially radically reconfigure financial orthodoxies. In my PhD, I explored these potentials through case studies of experimental renewable energy developments led by local government and community organisations, which are nevertheless limited to global north contexts of Australia, the UK, and Sweden. So I'll start with the first example, the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, which was the first group renewable electricity purchasing model implemented in Australia. MREP was announced in 2017 and was co-designed and negotiated between 14 public and private corporate entities in Melbourne. And this included 4 city councils, universities, banks, and other corporations. MREP was innovative because it allowed a group of relatively small corporate urban end users to collectively support the development of a new wind farm in the region, and in doing so, purchase 100% of their energy needs from that wind farm for 10 years. Nevertheless, the MREP model follows business as usual, growth-oriented financial logics in a couple of ways. First, the 10-year purchasing agreement provides future revenue certainty for the private developer to obtain project finance to build the wind farm. In this case, local governments and other local corporations play the role of guarantor for private capital investment between incumbent commercial banks and a private developer. The ability for local governments to engage in this way required capacity building, legal representation and documentation, and complex ongoing negotiations. Second, the wind farm's location is optimized based on environmental conditions and anticipated revenues, namely available grid infrastructure and land, estimated output in local climate conditions, and resulting market prices. I wouldn't call this an egregious example by any means, but it does illustrate how innovative finance can work to maintain and expand existing socio-material orders. Equally, the initiatives I studied demonstrate how urban actors are negotiating financial standards and expectations around loan repayment terms and the cost of capital to meet social and environmental aims. In other words, urban actors are innovating within orthodox financial conditions to redefine the parameters of economic viability or bankability for new urban renewable energy infrastructures. Darebin City Council in Melbourne's inner north established a financing model for aged and disability pensioner homeowners to install solar PV on their roofs in 2013. And this scheme is known as Solar Savers. The program has since been expanded in Darebin and piloted by several other councils through a state-funded Victorian Local Government Greenhouse Alliance initiative from 2017. The scheme aims to address an upfront cost barrier for residents to purchase solar PV and help low-income households save money on electricity bills. In turn, the scheme aims to reduce electricity consumption from the grid as part of its climate change mitigation strategy. In this arrangement, council funds rooftop solar installations for residents within its municipality as a type of loan. Solar Savers departs from growth-oriented financial products by restructuring household credit over a longer repayment period of 10 years with zero interest. While the scheme treats solar as a private financial asset by creating a threshold for participation based on estimated cost savings, it does so to minimise financial harm and ensure that households are at least $100 better off from day one, or year one, I should say. This mechanism is underpinned by relations of trust and esteem between council as a lender and solar broker and citizens as borrowers. Moreover, through the special property tax card charge, which is how local government provides the loan and recoups the repayments, local government is able to provide credit to households within the municipality, and repayments are ultimately recirculated through council expenditure. These adaptations facilitate greater socio-spatial inclusion and wealth distribution through urban renewable energy development, and local actors play a role in identifying and responding to social needs through finance. This scheme facilitates solar installations for aged and disability pension recipients, albeit predominantly owner-occupiers who were previously excluded from the solar market. Lastly, Solar Park is a cooperative organisation in Helsingborg in Sweden's southwest and was founded in 2015 by a local municipality-owned energy and communications company. In 2017, Solar Park established a large-scale solar PV plant on a sealed landfill site owned by a waste handling company. While the idea and administrative setup of the solar facility originated from the energy company representatives, the facility was crowdfunded through share purchases by individuals and small private businesses across Sweden. The co-op aimed to increase solar PV capacity in the city in response to the predominance of large-scale hydro energy production in the north and the need to phase out nuclear. This case illustrates a more radical reconfiguration of financial orthodoxies. Solar Park foregrounds no expectation of financial return for shareholders, nor guaranteed immediate recuperation of funds if people decide to withdraw. And this is because of their inability to sell electricity at a higher price, despite generous government subsidies. Without an easy means of exit or withdrawing capital, individuals who purchase shares buy into the solar array indefinitely. Moreover, the facility has been incrementally expanded at the landfill site when sufficient share purchases have been made. As such, the cooperative doesn't go into debt and doesn't speculate on future revenues. Secondly, Solar Park is underpinned by share-based equity investment by individuals to support community ownership of renewable energy facilities. This direct, transparent, democratic, and localized form of infrastructure ownership and management represents a radical counter to globalized and opaque forms of infrastructure development and ownership, which characterize privatized energy markets. Third, the location of the facility was primarily guided by qualitative concerns, namely a desire to establish solar within the urban boundary without compromising other land uses in the city, such as for housing. The group identified an opportunity to install solar on a former landfill site, which was otherwise unused, in contrast to developments guided more strongly by calculative logics. I'd like to conclude by reflecting on the conduct of just energy transitions research through applied collaborative projects focused on experimentation. And as Rob mentioned earlier, I've been increasingly engaging in this kind of research at MSDI, including a forthcoming industry project on delivering home energy upgrades in communities across Australia. A key takeaway from my research on the role of finance is the imperative to problematize accepted norms around infrastructure investment by governments, financial actors, and households to avoid entrenching social injustice and inequalities in the energy transition. One question this raises is how might the conditions for transformative financial innovation be cultivated or at least supported by just transition research? I suggest that place-based participatory research may advance energy justice, first where co-design processes allow for interrogation of financial orthodoxies rather than accepting these norms as common sense rules. And this may be enabled by the presenting of evidence of alternatives. Second, where diverse stakeholders can participate in decision-making, enabled by effective demystification of financial processes and logics to effectively allow non-financial actors to have a say in the development of financial solutions to mainstreaming, for example, renewable energy and energy efficiency. As mentioned, this must include adequate representation of First Nations peoples and traditional owners to enable self-determination and strengthen land and water rights. And third, in doing so, recognizing the knowledge and opinions of actors outside of government and industry as valuable, including end users and workers. These ideas raise further questions for me that may be valuable to explore, including what aspects of transitions are non-experts able to influence through co-design, and what limitations are evident in the practice of industry-funded research. And to what extent do co-design processes lead to more distributive and emancipatory outcomes? I'll end it there. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Paris. That was a really fascinating presentation with a lot of insights and very rich in a lot of comments and thoughtful thinking you put into that. So thank you very much for that. I'm seeing a lot of clapping hands, which I agree with. So I'd like to open up the floor for any questions or comments, and feel free to turn on your cameras and raise your hands to participate in the discussion. Usually it takes a bit of time before someone comes forward, so I'll pose the first question, Paris, and I guess my question relates back to the three examples that you provided, and the last one that was more reconfiguring or transformative in its approach took place in Sweden. And my question is, to what extent that makes a difference? Because arguably you could say in a country like Sweden, sort of community logics are already more present in energy systems anyway, compared to, for instance, the Australian context. So maybe it's transformative from a perspective of being in Australia, but maybe it's actually not that transformative in a country like Sweden. So I guess my question is sort of transferability of models such as these into the Australian context. What are some of the key challenges that you would see in doing so?
Thanks, Rob. That's a really interesting question, and I might start by noting that one of my other case studies, which I didn't have time to talk about today, was an energy cooperative in Bristol. And so looking at community energy in both the UK and Sweden highlighted first that in the UK, the cooperative movement has really strong origins and a long history. So cooperatives are much more popular there, certainly compared to Australia. In Sweden, I guess one thing that was evident was that cooperatives were not common in urban settings and as well for solar. So I think, and there was people talk to me about some contestation around wind energy, especially around there being potentially too much wind in the countryside and things like that. So a bit more ambivalence about those developments. But certainly, I think when I think about the conditions for these innovations to potentially emerge or transfer, I think definitely there are cultural trends that affect that. Community energy isn't as strong as prevalent in Australia. That's definitely true. So I think that the nature of transformation in different places will have to look different. And I think the transferability might be in the principles that underpin those mechanisms. So principles around local energy production, distributive outcomes, more greater transparency and democratic ownership and in decision making, things like that, that are more transferable than particular models. Yeah, that would be my response.
So thanks, Paris. I think that's a great insight, and reminds me some of the initial earlier questions that were addressed when some of the Dutch scholars came up with the transition management model, and when others started applying that, was questions around does transition management travel, because it also came with inherent assumptions around things like particular political cultures in the Netherlands organized around collaboration and negotiation. So there's, I guess, your point in terms of transfer of these kind of models, they need to be readapted into the context in which they are landing, I think is a really good one. I see that Rachel Walters, you've posted a question in the chat as well. Rachel, I would like to invite you to maybe ask the question yourself, if you want to.
Hi, thank you. And thanks, Paris. That was a very interesting presentation. And obviously with my PhD as well, I found it very informative. So just in regards to something I've read from Patrick Devine-Wright recently, I think it was 2019 that he mentioned this, that he said there was a decline in policy support for community energy initiatives in the UK in favour of going to like local community-led energy investments. I'm just wondering if you found that's made a difference in the UK in some of your case studies that you may have looked at. I guess the Bristol one that you've probably mainly looked at, but other ones potentially as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. This will be stretching my memory a little bit, but I believe I did come across this in the Bristol example. So in that case, there was a moment where government reduced significantly the feed-in tariffs for solar and just renewable energy generation in general, and that was one of the triggers for Bristol Energy Cooperative to reevaluate and redesign essentially their cooperative energy business model. So that in that case, they move from kind of a typical share-based model like the Swedish case to a more commercial approach to community energy. So they raised a significant amount of debt through bank loans and bond fundraisers, and through that they were able to continue to expand their kind of community renewable energy assets. But it was in part, the business model was in part affected by the change in feed-in tariffs and as you say, grant support for communities. And I'll probably leave it there, but it's certainly interesting to see how government support affects community uptake, and particularly the Bristol Energy Co-op example really stands out as an interesting shift from that kind of more simple model of share-based investment to a really kind of a portfolio, a commercial kind of energy development approach that they kind of continue to expand. But I'm probably not the best person to fully answer that question. So thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel and Paris. Yeah, Shireen, you're up next.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paris. It was a very rich presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it. I was actually wondering what your perspective is around some of the what we call community energy projects in Victoria and also New South Wales. So things like Hepburn Wind and Goulburn Solar Farm. So you might know, I saw from some of your citations that Dominic, one of our colleagues who's not here today, she looked at these projects more from a community empowerment perspective, not really on the financial side of it. And there were some of the projects that really stood out in terms of basically that community empowerment aspect. But I was wondering, now looking at your framework of looking at these projects from that maintain, adapt, and reconfigure perspective, on that spectrum, where do you see them stand?
Thanks for your question. I think without knowing in detail that those models, they do seem to fit within the kind of the reconfiguration model. And I should have said as well that the case studies, I don't mean to place the case studies in those categories. And in my PhD, I kind of pull apart various aspects that kind of fall across a number of categories. I think I would say that those, in part, it's a reconfiguration because of the way that communities are owning and operating those renewable energy facilities. It's also been kind of highlighted that community energy groups have a certain composition that doesn't necessarily capture the diversity of people in society, right? So
correct, yeah.
There are those access questions that come up in those kind of schemes, and I'm always interested to think a bit more about the electricity grid that we have right now that is in effect a way to socialize energy access and socialize energy costs, and something that some advocates highlight is that when you opt to buy solar or you buy into a community energy facility, you're kind of opting out of that socialized provision to a degree. Not many people are fully off grid, but you're essentially buying infrastructure that takes you out of that socialized pool. And so I'm interested in thinking about just energy transitions that try to capture all of the different ways that renewable energy can be accessed. And I think we're definitely not going to all end up on community energy facilities. And there's still a role for the kind of the regional grids to make sure that everyone has access to energy. And that's where the contestation comes in about how do we pay for infrastructure all collectively. What are we paying for? Like, what am I paying for as a non-solar household that benefits someone with solar, and is that fair? And you hear things about from solar advocates who say you can't tax the sun, don't make us pay, we're doing this great thing for the environment. And that's true, but there are flow-on impacts. So they're the kind of things that I, through the framework, I think can kind of capture all of those dimensions in a way. Sorry, I think I went on a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, thanks for your question.
Thanks, Shireen and Paris. Are there other questions from anyone in the audience? I'll have another one myself, which is more relating to your last slide on experimentation pathways. And I'm a fan of sort of the place-based participatory co-design approach, which I think is a great way of investigating some of these difficult questions. But it is also, I do struggle sometimes with the role as a researcher in these kind of approaches, because it is a bit of a challenging position to be in, particularly if you're both the co-creator and the co-designer and the facilitator and the engagement person in all of these processes, which it often comes down to. And at the same time, you're also being the researcher of those processes yourself, and having to evaluate whether the model, that sort of place-based participatory research approach, whether that model actually does make a difference or not. It's something we are, for instance, we now start doing sort of our engagement work around the Monash Net Zero Precinct, doing workshops with participants, and sort of we think we're doing something new, but how to actually be able to critically evaluate the benefits of these approaches beyond doing some before and after interviews or things like that. It's quite difficult, and obviously there's a need to sort of be engaged while at the same time remaining a healthy critical distance to what you're doing as well. Of course, there's a whole literature around action research and the kind of methodologies that go with that. But I wonder if, from your perspective, well, I would say there's another element there as well, which, for instance, you mentioned the project we are about to go into with the RACE consortium, is that in particular, if you start working closely with funders that are coming from, let's say more the market financialization kind of approach, there's another difficulty there as well. Like, although we even want to be the sort of this critical voice sometimes in this consortium, there's sort of power differences built into it as well. So how do you have any reflections on, I know this is a big question, but do you have any reflections you could offer from your knowledge of this subject?
Yeah, no, it is a big question, and I was conscious in the last slide of kind of opening up a lot of questions and not really going in detail in those. But I think, well, I probably would come back to a couple of the reflections I mentioned in that last slide around being as a researcher in that process, being able to help define the problem more broadly than perhaps the industry partners would define it. So yesterday, I happened to open Twitter at the right moment and saw the Energy Efficiency Council had posted a tweet about a statement made with financial sector. So it was calling for the government to, quote unquote, unlock billions in finance to enable energy efficiency upgrades, essentially. So it was very topical, but it kind of points to the way that industry talk about finance and how practitioners tend to think about the role of finance in climate development or climate change responses, I should say. And I would want to try to, I guess, politely or generously open up that question a little bit, to say that to ask questions around who benefits from private sector investment. How can the benefits accrue to the people who are affected by this transition? So those kind of key just transition questions, that's kind of a key part, to just keep asking those questions, and hopefully through a co-design process, present those questions to diverse stakeholders and try to amplify those marginalized voices, like households, but also workers as well. But I don't really know how that will go. And as I put in the slide, like, what are the limitations of a co-design process in that context? Would industry funders in the project turn around and say, okay, well, that's nice, but that's not feasible. We, of course, big financial investors need to have profits for their shareholders, so that's not going to happen. We've heard as well, government is not willing to necessarily put a lot of money into supporting, vulnerable households potentially, or just giving substantial grants to make sure that everyone has energy efficient homes. So I think there are a lot of challenges, and I guess I can see co-design kind of working to, more of a kind of an activist scholar approach, trying to focus on how the community can benefit and making sure the community is represented. But I think there are bigger processes like community organizing and electoral politics that probably have a larger impact on the problem frame, in terms of who is in Parliament and how they define the problem, and what policy possibilities are. I should say how they define the scope of policy intervention. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
Do you think there's sufficient political representation of things like the energy cooperative movement in Australia in the context of energy policy making? Yeah, I was reminded of some of the work that Brisbane, I forgot her first name, Mary Claire did on, I think, the energy cooperative movement in the Netherlands and the UK, and where this has been going on for a bit longer, and you could sort of see the signals that that movement now, through sort of collective organizations, was gaining a say at the table when important energy policy decisions were being made. And that's very important, I think, in terms of sort of that procedural justice that you mentioned. Do you think that's something that we see happening in the Australian context as well? Is there sufficient representation of that movement?
Yeah, I don't think it's very substantial. I know that there was an independent whose name I've forgotten, put forward a community power plan, and that didn't go very far in government. I've forgotten her name. I should know. But yeah, it doesn't seem to have that kind of, it still is very a niche movement, and it's kind of like the group of a super green kind of hippie type people who have time. They're probably retirees, they're the ones kind of doing that, and it's kind of on the side and not really a serious proposition for policy, I would say. But yeah, others might have more informed views on that.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Paris. Is there are there any other questions or comments, a final one from anyone here? If so, this is the time to do. Otherwise, I'm happy to close this meeting today and this seminar. And thank you again, Paris, for your great talk and your contribution. And it was great to finally get you here and hear more about your research. So thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining today. And I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Rob. Thanks everyone
Thanks.
for joining.